Hello again, and thank you for checking out the next episode in my Design Deconstructed series. We're going to continue looking at my story chapters that I built for Guild Wars 2. Specifically, we're going to take on Heart of Thorns, which was our first expansion, not episode 4, chapter 6 of Heart of Thorns, which was called Prisoners of the Dragon. This was one of the chapters that I felt the strongest connection to of all the chapters and the content that I worked on for Heart of Thorns. It had a significant story moment, number one, which I was really in tune with, and I really wanted to make sure that we delivered on because it was a big moment in the narrative. And then the other thing is that it just had so much more sort of efficiency around it. There was really nothing that went wrong with it. It was very smooth from start to finish. And so I was able to kind of devote a lot more time to the noodling around with the details and getting everything just right. So I really liked this episode, this chapter. I keep saying episode as if it's Living World, because that's kind of where my mindset goes. If you haven't played through Heart of Thorns, you might want to do so before watching this specific breakdown. I know it's been a couple years since we've released this expansion, so spoilers really aren't a thing, but you know, I know some players may not have seen everything yet. But there is a significant moment here that I would prefer you not spoil for yourself if you can help it, if you haven't played through the expansion. At any rate, this was also because of the significant story I was talking about, one of the most talked about chapters of Heart of Thorns, both internally and externally, because of the weight of this particular story moment at the end. Gave you my spoiler warning, so I'm just going to go ahead and talk about it here. At the end of the instance, one of our heroic, iconic characters, Air, who is the Norn mentor for your players, was killed. And meets her untimely end. And the way in which that happens was the subject of much discussion, both inside the studio and out. The interesting thing here is that it wasn't always Air who was on the chopping block. We ran through a number of scenarios. We knew that we needed to have dire consequences for the catastrophic failure of the Pact fleet launching an all-out assault on Morjamoth because they were sort of cocky and arrogant and believed that they could do to Morjamoth what they did to Zaitan, and they had a bigger fleet. It's because they were prepared now, and of course it was horribly wrong, and the entire fleet gets knocked out of the air by Morjamoth's vines. So yeah, there was a lot of grueling team meetings about this instance and this moment. We weighed the pros and cons of who would be on the chopping block, what would we do without that character or with that character's, death. We ultimately settled on Air after discussing. We knew we were going to kill Traherne, but we wanted to save that one for the final chapters. Zoja was certainly on the chopping block. Logan was on the chopping block, which is why both of those have significant moments at the end of this expansion as well, where they are sort of taken off the field. But we settled on Air here because ultimately the entire team felt that her journey had come to an end. She had been instrumental in reviving Destiny's Edge in order to defeat Zaitan, which was a huge, huge monumental thing that she did. And they struck the first blow against the Elder Dragons as part of the story. But moving forward, we really didn't see what her legend would grow to be on Tyria without it taking away from the player, because we wanted the player to take ownership now of sort of leading the charge against the Elder Dragons. And so Air was going to have to take a back seat to that effort. And so that didn't really feel good to us. And so we felt that she had attained everything that she needed to attain in her life. And as we've seen in season 4, we didn't have all of this fleshed out, but we definitely felt that having her sort of move on to the next world and enter the mists and become a spiritual warrior was a better outcome for her growth, because she has a whole new arc when you see her return in season 4, um, as one of the generals basically of Glint's army, which is an amazing accomplishment, really. It's very strange to think about, but we do have a world in which people do die and their spirits go on, and there is an afterlife, and so she's able to do that. Um, yeah, as I was saying, from the implementation side, this was one of the smoothest experiences I've had as a content designer. I think because we had such a hugely important emotional anchor point for me to work towards, um, it freed me up to get creative about the rest of the chapter. And that's where the idea for, like, the resilient jungle tendrils that you have to use fire grenades for, the whole prison break thing, and the boss mechanic there, um, which is one of the things that I did for this instance that I haven't typically been one to appreciate doing, which is creating a boss and doing a boss mechanic. I'm actually not a big fan of boss fights in games. I don't like them. I think that they oftentimes are a crutch on a way, or used as a way to inject sort of what I think of as artificial variety into your content experience. To me, it's a lot of times I feel like boss fights just kind of take away from the whole mechanic that you've designed the game around, because all of a sudden now, no, your skills aren't good enough. The things that you've been doing for the entire game aren't good enough. Now you have to play this puzzle and figure out what is the designer thinking. And um, yeah, and we had been getting a lot of pressure from design leads and management to have more of these, what we called design encounters, which is their word for boss fights. And so we were trying to get as many of those into all the Heart of Thorns chapters as we could. I'm not a fan, but in this case, because I am a team player, I went ahead and did this. And I wanted to kind of take ownership of this one myself, because I actually kind of wanted to test my own theory of whether or not I felt, you know, if I didn't like boss fights, could I make a boss fight that I would actually enjoy? Could I do that and stretch my skills and work outside my comfort zone for a little bit and take that challenge on, and not have it feel like a cheat to add difficulty or variety, or take away player agency to be able to play the way that you want to play, and not have to dictate something to the player. In the end, I feel like that's not something I successfully did, because the mechanic is definitely you've got to do X to defeat the boss. Um, so I can't say that I proved myself wrong. I still don't think I am a huge fan of boss fights. I don't think they're a bad thing necessarily. I don't want to come down too hard on the side of games that rely on those kinds of mechanics. Obviously, they do quite well. They're just not my cup of tea. So I try and avoid it in the content that I build, or in the games that I play. I grudgingly get through a lot of boss fights. I use the internet a lot to cheat my way through boss fights if I can, to understand what the mechanic is supposed to be, because I don't like playing guessing games like that. Um, I would say that, for every rule, there's an exception. And for me, this was mine, to add this boss fight here. Yeah. Uh, so that's all I think I wanted to say about that. I think it just ended up in the end reinforcing my feelings about boss fights. I don't have regrets about trying it, because I think that it's always good to push yourself and challenge yourself to think about your beliefs in a different way. And sometimes they come away changing your mind. In this case, I definitely felt, no, this is something that if I'm going to have a boss fight in my content, I will probably either tweak it so that it feels more cinematic and less about a mechanic, which I will do, which I did a lot of in Heart of Thorns, or um, not Heart of Thorns, sorry. I did that for Path of Fire, where I took the boss fights and I turned them more into cinematic moments. Um, and then the other thing is, for this boss fight in particular, um, I just think it was important to put myself in a position to challenge my beliefs at this point in my career. So yeah. Anyway, that's enough of the preamble to things. Let's hop into the game and let's run through Prisoners of the Dragon. Okay, so we're going to be in Verdant Brink here. Let's replay this chapter. I should have been at the instance entry. Oh well, it shouldn't take me long to get there.
Help us collect weapon parts so I can build a bar.
Into the giant log. All right. Here with our friends again. We've got the whole team back together again now that Bram and Gritlock have rejoined us. So, quick design note here. One of the things that I did a lot of in the Heart of Thorns chapters it was environmental blocking, which is a term that we use to describe setting up um, sight lines for players and guiding the player. So in this case, you're coming down this thing, and this was open before. This was open before, and so I put the gate here, because the prison is literally right on the other side of this bridge, and we didn't want. We obviously have to find a way in there, so that's our main obstacle that we can't overcome. And then I added this Mordrum spawner here as a way to sort of gate off players from having easy access to this. I couldn't fully block them off. You can come around this way if you want. But again, it's just to set up that, you know, guiding the player towards where we want them to be without being too heavy-handed about it. It's a lot of psychology. Game design is trying to think of how do I make something that is visually readable and visually directing the player to a particular point that you want them to be going in without being too overly. I don't like to guide the player too much because we want a little bit of exploration to happen. All right, so here we have the team working out a plan. Ritlock and Bram have scouted the camp out already, so they have some inside information about the camp, but they were waiting for us to take it on because it's a fairly sizable camp that they wouldn't necessarily be able to take on by themselves. So we're going to have some dialogue here. One of the things I was going to bring up, I didn't show this in the last chapter, but I did that for that chapter and this one. This fleet map, I say fleet, that was our internal name. Verdant Brink is the name of the map. Because of the way that it was built, it has all these platforms, and you can literally drop off into the chasm of nothingness. And the way that our instance boundaries work in our game is if you go outside the instance entry, or inside boundaries rather, you get kicked out of the instance, which really sucked in these maps. Because, you don't want to accidentally have people get kicked out. So for these instances, I put what I call safety nets. So if you drop off and you go down here, I kill you, and then I teleport you back up. Because, again, that is a more favorable outcome than having to, drop out of the instance and replay it from the start. Because this expansion, Heart of Thorns, also was before we had the technology, or the technique rather, because actually I think we did have the technology, we just hadn't thought of using it this way. The technique of creating checkpoints in an instance, so that if you logged out or got disconnected, that you would have a way to get back in and not have to replay significant chunks of content. So we didn't have that here to rely on, and so it ended up being the case that we had to do everything we could to make sure that these instances were not that long. I think that our target for all of these was like 15 to 20 minutes of gameplay, and then do whatever we could to make it so that you didn't accidentally get kicked out or lose progress if we could help it. Another thing that I didn't note at the time, but one of the things that we had started to do a lot of is on the quest UI in the upper right, we're trying to do a lot more about being conscious of when these quest steps got revealed, when these were updated, how they were worded. We spent a lot of time on Heart of Thorns going through, like we did an entire just iteration pass on just that. Um, in previous Living World content and the personal story, those were really, really not given a lot of attention. It was basically just straightforward. Here's what you have to do. Here's a green star on the map. We were trying to be a lot more conscious of this stuff as we got better at our storytelling, because we didn't want this to ever give you information you wouldn't have as the commander. This should never break the fourth wall is one of the rules that we put in place. I can't say we kept to it every single time, but that was an attempt to try to make that feel like it was part of, um, you know, the whole overall package and not just a afterthought, which I think it had been for some time, where we just didn't really give much thought to it. All right. One of the things that you will notice about Ritlock is this is one of the first. This is one of the first time. This is actually the first time I think we get to see him as a revenant. He does show up at the end of the first instance, but he really doesn't do a whole lot. Um, and so I definitely spent a good amount of setup time when I was working on this chapter, building out what his skills were, which was tough because the Revenant was still very much work in progress at that point, and we didn't really know all of the skills. Nothing was finalized. Nothing was set in stone, and so Ritlock as Revenant, which actually was called Reckoner at this point. It just wasn't in place. And so I had to take some guesses and I had to work with the skills designers on what he would be doing. I think that this actually ended up being one of the skills that they kept, so I lucked out. I didn't have to adjust. I mean, we always had the fallback of, hey, it's Ritlock and he's the first Revenant, and so he might not always have exactly what players get. He might have a little bit of a you know better buff, or I don't know. Our iconics definitely are um, not not limited to the same rules that players are limited to. So we can get a little bit creative about that. Um, but you can see he has a thing that basically pumps might onto everyone around him. Um, I don't know that Revenants have that capability to do that constantly the way that Ritlock does, but yeah, this is one of those things again where it's like that's Ritlock's ability. He basically boosts people. I don't think we ever followed through on that though. I don't think he's ever used this ability since. So I don't know. All that hard work to make him feel like a different character here, combat wise, skill wise, and I don't think we necessarily translated any of that forward. Yeah, that's one of those dangers of it's probably my fault that I didn't do a good enough job communicating it out to the rest of the team who are using Ritlock in other content. Although I don't know, because he technically has all those skills on him as a species. So if anyone else used his species, he should have all that stuff. So I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, I will also talk about bonus achievements real quick. This was another case where I wanted to have these bonus achievements that launched bonus events, basically. So in this case, Bygarth is here. He's one of the guys who you meet in the personal story, and he basically, was put in this cave. He's not dead yet, so you can revive him. You ask how you can help, and it doesn't work anymore. What the heck? That's weird. It's a weird lag. Um, and so you volunteer, and it starts a bonus event gathered by Garth's Organs team. I talked about this in the previous chapter, but I wanted to show you one here. So he is going to run off. Unfortunately, it does. this is one of those cases too where part of the reason I want to show this off is because I like looking at things that I do wrong and deconstructing that as well. And so here's a case where Bygarth is running off. He started this event, and I kind of wish that I hadn't done it this way, because when you get to the top of this rise, you have a cinematic and you're going to move into the story, uh, and he doesn't really fit there. So I kind of wish that I had put him maybe up here past the tripwire for the cinematic, so that you would, be incentivized to watch the cinematic, do the story part, and then trigger this bonus event. Yeah, hindsight being what it is, I would have changed it there, but I can't do it now, so there it is. um, I will also call out that the cinematic. I used a fair number of these sort of like camera fly through cinematics in Heart of Thorns. We backed way, way off of using these in Path of Fire. In fact, that came directly from Mo. He does not like these. Um, he thinks that we should be setting this stuff up in game. And for the most part, I absolutely agree. Philosophically, seeing things in game is a way more powerful thing. Um, but at the same time, a moment like that, being able to make smart choices about, hey, there's a lot of enemies here, and it doesn't make sense for the commander to just rush in, right, and take on 200 guys all at once. um, so maybe they would stop and assess the battlefield before going in. But if you give that control specifically to the player, they may decide to just go rush in. And Mo's argument would be, well, then let them go rush in and deal with that, the consequence of that. And I agree. Again, I think philosophically, I think in principle that can work. I think in practice, I actually do like using some of these cinematic moments to sort of set up the action and give you context for, hey, here's what you're going to face. Because in that, specifically, I did that because when you're standing here, it only looks like there's 5, 6 guys, and there's not. There's about 20 or so, I believe. And it's a lot of guys here, a lot of enemies here, because you have your entire team with you. And when you're dealing with the entire team with you, you as a player are much stronger than you are by yourself. And so you can take on a large group like this. It's not easy still, especially with the Mortem Guard being what they are. They lay down a bunch of fields and AoE attacks that, can make, standing around and taking on 20 of these guys a challenge, even with your full team. So I wanted to set it up. I really wanted to make sure that the player was aware, hey, by the way, and I work with narrative to get those lines in there where Ritlock sort of is the one who's like, well, maybe we should hold off and wait and see what we can do. And it's the commander who's like, no, look, we've taken on groups this size before. This team is really talented. We can do this. So yeah, I think that cinematics to set up the action or put context on the action or show you what's coming and give you a bit of a warning before throwing you into the fire is not a bad thing. But yeah, there's a philosophical difference there. I don't think there's a wrong or right answer. I think that there has to be room for both, and not necessarily, go one or the other exclusively. But yeah, I definitely lost those fights on Path of Fire. There were definitely several of those that I implemented on Path of Fire that ended up getting cut and pulled back out into gameplay, and that put other constraints on the storytelling, because I had to then account for the fact that, well, and especially with players having mounts in Path of Fire, there was no time to do any setup. It was really just bouncing from action to action to action, because that's just the way it was designed. So yeah, there was a lot of these sort of, I call close quarter battles in this instance, because of the way that this environment was set up. We're kind of sneaking our way through the cliff tops here, and there's not a lot of space to have a big fight. This is probably the biggest space I think we have. Maybe the boss arena works well. Oh, I don't know. Maybe that's not true. I feel like this was the um, yeah. I don't know what I was gonna say there. Never mind. Uh, I likened this to a big comic book fight when I was looking at how I was implementing this because it is one of the few times as well. This is the first time in this expansion that we have the whole team together because Ritlock and Bram ran off at the end of the last chapter, and so we didn't see them really all together. And again, Ritlock shows up at the end of chapter one, but this is the full team together fighting as a unit, and I kind of likened it to this is our Avengers moment, right? Like this is when the entire guild is here, everyone's playing their role, everyone is doing their stuff. Um, just as with Ritlock, I put all the iconic skills together to make sure that they did what they needed to do. To Bram has his big guardian shield. Kaz uses her illusions. Kanaka lays down some mines, I think, or is he? I don't know if even he's doing the mines yet. Um, Rox has her barrage. So everybody had a role to play, and I wanted to feel like a big comic book fight to showcase these characters and showcase what was talked about in the cinematic, which is that these guys are a badass team of heroes and that they can handle any challenge. All right, and then last thing before we move on to the next part of this chapter is we had a lot of discussion about this Ritlock moment. For those who are familiar with the lore of the story at this point, Ritlock had come back from the mists in chapter one and had not done a very good job of answering what happened to him, where he had been, why now he is all of a sudden a revenant and with a blindfold on. There was a lot of unanswered questions about Ritlock that players had wanted because there was something of a content gap between when we had last seen him jump into the mists and this expansion. And so there was a lot of burning questions. And internally, we talked a lot about how we were going to address those questions, when we were going to address those questions. Players now know that the challenge of answering those questions was that him telling us would have given away huge reveals on the following Living World season as well as Path of Fire. So we couldn't tell players a lot about Ritlock's time to miss. So we deliberately had to sort of have him throw shade and obfuscate his story and say, "Oh, later, Cub," um, which became a meme, Guild Wars 2 meme. The blow off thing was definitely a thing we took heat for. Uh, Maybe rightfully so. I don't know. It's one of those things that we try to make it so that it's building anticipation and speculation on the story, um, but without really, I think, taking into account the full impact or the weight of how long that was going to be for players to have to wait uh, to hear the answer on that because it was the following season and then not until the next expansion that we find out what Ritlock's story was. So that's a long time to ask players to wait for a resolution on a story. In hindsight, I think there probably were things we could have done to drop some more hints and give a little bit more context or background on his time in the mists. I think him learning how he became a revenant and the things that he did with Glint in the Mists would have been something that we could have explored further without him divulging his role in the Balthazar scenario. But again, hindsight's 2020. We did what we did. It was also a case that we just really didn't have the time to devote to individual stories. Heart of Thorns moved at a lightning pace, and it was really tough to find moments of kind of quiet and calm where we could have those kinds of conversations with our team. And so here he just says, "Yeah, let's deal with Morgemoth first," which is not the best thing, but it is what it is. So, all right. Tendrils. Yes, let's talk about tendrils. So we come up here and we see these tendrils, and here is another of my mistakes. I did not fully account for how narrative and gameplay were going to work together to sell this. So if you look at the storytelling here, the storytelling is by the 6th, that's a lot of tendrils. Gritlock says, too many. We can't afford to get bogged down here. We need something to clear the path. Well, that's true. But it's not as true as it would be if he had said something more along the lines of, hey, let's go attack these tendrils. You then go attack these tendrils, and they continue to revive. And then somebody calls out, oh, these things seem to not be able to be killed. We need some new thing to kill them. Maybe we should try burning them. Because as you see, they're immune to all damage. They zero, all these zeros keep popping up. That's because they are immune to all normal damage. And what you need to do is come over here, back to the airship debris, and up on this little hill here, by this broken open thing, there is a packed ordnance crate, which you pick up, and then you get fire grenades. And these fire grenades are specifically, you know, like napalm grenades, basically. Um, and I tried to call that out with the quest text, where it says tendrils burned by fire grenades. That's a bit on the nose in terms of quest text. I didn't like having to put that there, but that was the solution to the narrative, the story, the dialogue there wasn't specific enough. It didn't call out that, hey, these things are too tough for our normal weapons, and we need to burn them. It also doesn't help that I could not, for the life of me, figure out a way to have the iconics not futilely attacking these things over and over again, even though we established that, oh, by the way, these things need fire grenades to be killed. So yeah, not a great moment. I'll be honest. Like I say, this went smoothly, except for the fact that in hindsight, I made some mistakes that I wish I could take back. Yeah, that's how it goes sometimes. Another thing that I think I would call out here as things I would improve had I actually thought about it at the time, and I didn't. The feedback here is awful. There is no indication that you have struck a blow that is going to actually kill it. I believe at some point I had intended to put fire effects on these tendrils and show them burning. I don't know why. It's possible that I did, and then for whatever reason the effect isn't just playing, which might be a bug. Um, it's been so long that I really couldn't say which is the case. So I'm gonna take responsibility for it and say no. I probably just didn't put um, fire effects on them. So the feedback here is just not adequate. It's not enough to tell you, oh, by the way, um, this thing that you are doing is actually succeeding, especially because there's so much ground clutter here between the red rings from the poison attacks and the ground targeting and all the spell effects going off at the base, the poison bursts, all of it. It's so much clutter, which is a problem our game has just in general, but here in particular, um, it gets in the way of the mechanic. And so this is, in hindsight, one of those things that I definitely would have done better uh, had I had another opportunity, or you know been able to come at it with the eyes that I have now. At the time, it seemed just fine. I was too close to it. I was like, well, I know how to do this, so clearly it works, and it doesn't. Yeah, so it was just a disconnect. I think it could have been solved with a line. I think it needed additional feedback. Um, yeah, designing, implementing, and making this work. The grenade boxes was also kind of a pain. It took way more effort than I thought it should have. I ended up using some sort of like complicated like buff mechanic. This would have been much simpler had we actually had the technology that we got with I think it was maybe season 3 after this expansion, but it could have been Path of Fire, where we had special action button, which would have been really really helpful here, and then the ability to have because see, this is basically a buff. This grenade ammo, it's a buff, and when you lose that buff, you lose your grenades, which is dumb. There's no reason why that would be the case. I made it for an hour, so your chances of seeing that happen are very very low, but still, it could happen. Um, yeah, it's one of those things that technology and the techniques that we have pioneered in the last couple of years at Guild Wars 2 would have been much made something like this much better. Because we also had the ammo count system, so that you could have a skill that has a number of counts on it, which is basically the same thing as a buff, but instead of it being, on a timer, it's just there all the time, and as soon as you use up all those charges, you're done. All right, so let's talk about this boss fight. I am not a fan of this boss fight. As I said, I'm not a fan of any boss fights, but I am not a fan in particular of how I implemented this boss fight. See, I said that at the beginning, at the top of this discussion, that I'm not a fan of boss fights, and that this was a smooth thing. And now I'm playing through this, and I'm thinking, wow, maybe I shouldn't have made this so smooth. Maybe I should have had more challenges, and then it would have turned out better. But yeah, basically, there were sort of two competing things that I was trying to reconcile. One is I hate introducing a mechanic and then dumping it the minute you bypass the thing. So I didn't want to have these fire grenades be something you use on the tendrils, and then that's it, right? Like, it needed to be used for something else. So that the tendrils were a sort of training for this boss fight. Because one of the rules with design encounters is if you're going to have a design encounter, you have to try as much as you can to sort of teach a mechanic ahead of time. That was something that we were learning with raids. Obviously, raids came out with this expansion, so we were still learning some of these lessons about raids and design encounters. I mean, design encounters were in fact an offshoot, a way of improving on player skill. And so we wanted to do that across the board, and not just for the heavy encounters like raids, but to sort of introduce it here so that even casual PvE players had to kind of learn different ways of using skills, different ways of manipulating their skill bar or their other stuff. In this case, the grenades replace your entire skill bar, which again is another thing that I regret that I didn't have the special actions skill to do, because that would have been really helpful if you could fight without having to just throw grenades. To try to offset some of that, I made the grenades knock this guy back a bunch, which is a little comical in hindsight. I wish I'd done that a little differently. Probably wouldn't have done a knockback, but maybe like a stun. And you still have some of these tendrils that pop up that just complicate the fight. And I don't know, it's a pretty simplistic boss mechanic, which is just the dude heals up when he gets to 25%. He heads over to this bloom. The bloom feeds him energy. And the reason I did this as well was because I wanted to sort of foreshadow something that you see later in the Mordremoth fight. You see this black sort of tendril that extends from the Overseer to this Mordrim Bloom. That's directly lifted from the final fight against the Mordremoth Avatar, where he corrupts sort of these, I don't know, constructs, I guess you would call them, of your allied friends, Britlock and Marjorie, and the people that can come into the mindscape with you to fight against Mordremoth's Avatar. And again, this is a bit early to foreshadow a mechanic like this, but I wanted to sort of visually communicate that, oh, Mordremoth and Mordrem in general have this ability to sort of share energy together, and it ties them together. And in order to defeat one, you have to defeat the other first. So again, that was my intention with this boss fight, was to have those two sort of things established. Um, I don't know. I think it's not a terrible boss fight, but it's not a great boss fight. Um, this thing, uh, it's competent. It does what I needed it to do, and that's about it. So that's all I will say about that, because I think that's all I care to. All right, Ritlock's gonna go over here. The other thing, following up on what we talked about, where Ritlock is showing off his revenant abilities, we wanted him specifically to do the whole, glint wing swoop, and it knocks over Mordrum walls that normally you wouldn't be able to get past. I gave him that special ability in part so that I could have, some convenient gating, because again, we don't have dynamic instance boundaries yet. But also to, again, sell that Ritlock is kind of a badass. And given that he's the original Revenant, he has a bit more power behind his channeling of Glint's energy, maybe, than other Revenants might. Anyway, I'm not going to do the bonus event, but basically the premise here is that, Occam and the Engineer Corps, I believe is what they were called. They're open world characters. I added them here. You resurrect them, and they all run over to Bygarth, who is hanging out down by a what's it called? Down by where we ran into the first group of Mordrum, out in that opening area. So if you gather all four of them together down there, they rebuild the tower, which is a setup for what they do in the open world. And so I did that there because I wanted to have a little bit of overlay and overlap in the narrative between open world and story, which is something that we were continuing to try to improve on, because we hadn't been doing a great job of that. I think Heart of Thorns did a fair job of it, but I don't think we did a great job of it. Things like this, I think, were helpful. But again, this only appears during replaying the mission, which is, in hindsight, not a great thing, because we probably would have wanted to have that story being told throughout. Anyway, this was a challenging moment because players have access to gliders and NPCs can't glide. So what do you do? Well, thankfully, Casimir has portals. So she's basically talking about portaling the team down on these tiny little cliffs, which I kind of wish that I had the time to, if you decided to sort of hang out, Casimir would actually do that. We don't actually get to see it because that was going to be a lot of work to set up, because I would have had to have nav mesh put on, because I don't know how many people know this, but NPC characters and player characters have different collision states. Players use a system which we called collision, proper collision, which is, and then NPCs use one that's called nav mesh, which is a simplified version of collision. So players collide on pretty much everything because we have an agent boundary around us, and then there's a set of geometry that we can, that is one for one, pretty much, not one for one, but one for one of the collision shapes that are set up by the artists. And the nav mesh is not. The nav mesh is only on certain objects that the map artist specifies. So NPC characters can't go on all the same surfaces that players can. And so, for example, if I jump down here, I could hop on some of these little ledges, and no problem. But if NPCs were following me now, they would blip and teleport to me, because if they were trying to follow me, they can follow me and get my position, but they wouldn't know anything about the terrain around me because there's no nav mesh on these platforms. So yeah, they would have had, the artist would have had to set that up, and we didn't want to waste the time. So player gets to glide down here, and I trigger another cinematic to set up some action again. And here I did this for two reasons. One is to, again, establish the context, show you the surroundings, show you the enemies, give you a bit of sort of forewarning and knowledge of what's coming, how many guards there are, how many patrols there are, um, what the prisons look like, um, you know, and also I then, in the background, while I'm panning the camera around in the other direction, I'm also teleporting all the NPCs down behind you. Again, smoke and mirrors, that's game development. Um, hey, how about that? So yeah, now we're gonna go do a awesome prison break. Now I still have grenades. I'm gonna drop those because you don't need them for this fight. Although you can use them. They do damage the Mordrum guard, and they do, I think, still knock back enemies. I spent some amount of time trying to make the enemies in this zone feel intelligent. We had a prototype version of a new AI system for Heart of Thorns that almost none of us content designers actually use. I think a few designers used it in open world content, but story designers didn't use it at all, because although it was powerful and it was actually very sophisticated, it ended up being too sophisticated to use easily. So just for context, most of our AI is not actual AI. It's hand scripted. So, example, all of the allied characters here, they are all using scripts. They are running scripts. They are only behaving in the exact way in which I have directed them to behave. They don't do anything that I didn't have full control over. The AI took a lot of that control out and ran a system in the background. The problem with the new AI at this point in Heart of Thorns development was that it didn't have a good and easy way to debug it. With scripts, I can run a script debugger and I can see exactly what every character is doing and I can parse it and understand it. The AI was just not quite there yet, and so it was really tough to use AI. So I had to script all of these enemies as well. Uh, the AI probably would have made some of this easier, at least easier to set up, but not easier to debug, and so I avoided it. But I tried to make these guys somewhat smart. They react to you attacking cages. If they're within line of sight of each other, they will come to each other's aid. Again, these are things that an AI system should just provide. We didn't have that capability. So I ended up hand scripting a lot of this. So here we broke out a Nightmare Courtier from this cage. That is a case of us again dropping the ball between narrative and design. We wanted to have this established in this chapter that Morgermoth is not discriminating. Anybody who opposes him is going into cage or becoming a blighted creature, and that includes the Nightmare Court. So even though Nightmare Court had been one of our more, egregiously evil enemies, because they're just cruel and heartless individuals typically, we wanted to sort of see a slightly more sympathetic side to them, that they're also victims here, and we have a common enemy in Morgermoth. I can't say that we did a great job of setting that up here because this is happening in the middle of this, sort of really tense combat situation, and so we really don't have much chance to describe the action or the scenario as much as we are just seeing it in action, and it works on some level, but I don't think it works well enough. I think it still left a lot of open questions. Um, you know, about what does that mean? Does that mean that the Nightmare Court are going to join us? Are they going to be our allies now? Um, I mean, there's a lot of Nightmare Court stuff in this expansion that was, we dropped the ball on as well. Like once we see Fallon and her story resolved here, um, I mean, she goes on to become a major villain figure for this chapter, or for this expansion rather. But we never follow up really on what happens to the Nightmare Court after that, right? Like we see a couple of Nightmare Court show up in Dragon Stand, and that is sort of comes out of left field, and there's no setup for that whatsoever. We actually did have some interactables in this area that was planned. Um, that not only were you breaking prisoners out, but they had like their belongings, their possessions were also taken here to this camp. Um, but there were two problems with that. One is we just ran out of time. Narrative didn't have time to write all that dialogue and all that extra text because we were behind we were having to do some rewrites for the story, for the main path story, and so that impacted our ability to have sort of extra story tacked on. And then two, this ended up being less of a camp than I anticipated. Like when we talked about, hey, this is a Mordrum camp. Like this is the space that we got, and doesn't really look like a camp as you see. I mean, there weren't any tables, there weren't like, and I think in the end that's probably better because I don't know that it's really strictly makes sense to have Mordrum have a camp, with tables and chairs and tents and stuff like that. Because I mean, they're plant creatures, so I think this thematically works better. Um, but that did mean that hey, without a camp, I wouldn't have known where to put collectibles, and stuff on desks and tables, items on tables and all that good stuff, and chests of you know evidence and taking stuff that was taken off of the prisoners. Also, there's a bug here, as you probably had noted while I was playing and talking. Not all the prisoners are spawning anymore. I don't know why that is the case. I remember seeing it a couple times when we were in development, but then I thought I had fixed it. Apparently, something broke in the interim, and so part of the reason that there is a failure to set up the Nightmare Court is there were supposed to be three of them in these tents. Like every one of those prison cages that I broke open was supposed to have a prisoner in it. Three of them were Nightmare Court. And as far as I know, I think only one of them spawned. Yeah, one of them spawned, and so you're getting a third of the story. That sucks, right? I don't know if there's a way to address that now, or if it's even worth addressing. But that's one of the flaws of spawning characters inside gadgets is just really really crappy. Um, our game didn't support it well. The game just doesn't know like Aaron Fallon had that problem, and I had to do a bunch to make sure that they were uh, spawned and visible in here. In fact, in point of fact, what I did is they're not actually inside this cage because this cage uh, is a visual graphic only. And what I did is there's actually an invisible collision cylinder around this thing uh, to fake, which you can see because you can see watch the NPCs, they walk right through it. Because again, players cannot collide with this thing, or players can collide with this thing, NPCs do not. So Bram and Canuck could go inside the cage and hang out with Bram and Fallon. Yeah, this is one of those things that I had to do this because there was no other way to get this. The reason for that, actually, if you want to know the technical side of this, is that this bramble of vines is actually connected to this whole thing. If you go over here and select where's the selection thing? If I select that, it's yeah, yeah. So yeah, so see, The selection thing is really right down there at the base of this, on the other side of this chasm, which is why I couldn't have real collision here, because the collision would have been around this thing, or I would have had to make a collision cylinder that encompasses the entire chasm, and that would have sucked, because then you would have had this invisible wall that prevents you from going anywhere, and it just wouldn't have made any sense. So I had to get really, really grossly creative. I would not have done this the same way, but that's, well, I don't know. I'm not sure I could have found another way, because this needed to be this way for the cinematic, because as you'll see after I defeat this sky cell, which I don't know why I called this a sky cell. It's not a sky cell. Yeah. Die. There's also a bug here where I think the Biconics have stopped attacking these cages. Anyway, so yeah, I see it gets pulled over across the chasm, and that was done that way because we needed the narrative reason why when you break Fowlin and Air out of their cage, you aren't immediately there. They're on the other side of the chasm, and so you're now racing to rescue them on the other side of the chasm, which sets up this moment between Fowlin and Air where she gets stabbed by Fallon, who is, prototypically evil. She just can't help herself. This is who she is. She's a nasty person. Despite the fact that technically we're on the same side here because she hates Morgemoth, we hate Morgemoth, we should be able to fight together, but no. And then Air being Air, turn around is fair play. You stab me in the back, I stab you. And then Fallon gets impaled by a vine tooth and carried off into the jungle. And then we have this moment. And this is the big moment I was talking about. So let me talk about this cinematic. I'll start while it's playing a little bit. And then we'll talk about it when it's done. Yeah, this was a tough one. We spent a lot of time on the cinematic. In the end, I think this is probably as good as it can get, given the constraints that we had at the time. I look at this and I think, we could do better. But at the same time, it's shipped. There's nothing I can do to pull it back and redo it. There was a lot of discussion, both internally and externally, as I had mentioned at the top of this, that Air going out the way she does is not satisfactory. And I sympathize. I understand where that comes from. I don't personally think it's a terrible ending. I think the way that we tried to communicate what was happening is that when Fallon stabs her, that's a mortal wound. Air is dead at that point. There's nothing that she can do. She knows she's going to bleed out. It's going to be a slow, death. And she doesn't want that. And so when the vine tooth comes and faces her down, she's kind of too weak to fight. And she knows she's going to lose that fight because she's already dead. Fighting here would only accelerate her death, because the more she, sort of becomes active, the more her blood will pump and the quicker she will bleed out. So I think she, in her mind, reaches a moment of peace and calm and says, I'm accepting my fate. And she's supposed to stand tall there and just be like, I'm meeting my fate. This is it. There's nothing I can do. I need to show my son this is how a Norn goes out. On your feet, defiant to the end. Now, some people have said, well, but that would mean fighting, right? Like, why would a Norn not fight? That is the expression of defiance. I think for me, I think we wanted to strike the balance between defiance and acceptance. She's defying death, a slow death, but she's accepting a death against a more powerful enemy. And so I think that that's kind of the way that I look at it. Again, does that all come across? There's a lot of nuance there that I don't know that we fully captured. Yeah, I think part of it is that we were still And this is not a knock on the cinematics team, but they were still, getting used to having to do a lot of hand scripted animation and player expressions. I definitely think that um, Air's expression there is not ideal. I think we worked on it. We workshopped it together in a room and went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and we settled on that one. I don't think it was necessarily the right one, but at some point you just have to go with your gut and say, well, this is probably what we can accomplish given everything we have. So that was the expression or the cinematic that we ended up shipping. Like I say, I think it was competently done, and I do think it's a still a powerful emotional moment. But I do think that this is one of those that, knowing everything that we now know and all the techniques and technology that we have now, we probably could have done a much better job than we did. All right, so here we have our first fight against the Vine Tooth. Um, I call this Vine Tooth Junior because he does the basic attacks that the Vine Tooth does, but he's definitely a lot less lethal, at least to players, than the open world or the other versions of him that you run into. It's tough because we wanted to show that he's super badass, and that's why he is able to take out Air, who is no slouch in combat herself. Um, and one of the ways that I tried to sell that here is, if you noticed in the previous fights, none of the iconics would ever go down because they were designed not to. But in this fight, they do go down to again. Oh, that's unfortunate. Vine Tooth was not supposed to just blink away there. He was supposed to stay and not decay. All right. Anyway, that's probably enough about that fight. It was not supposed to be a super complex, uh, huge fight. It was more just to introduce the character of the Vine Tooth, the creature type rather, and to sort of give you a preview of its skills and what it could, do. Because this is the end of the story chapter, and we didn't want to put another huge fight, especially because again, this was not the biggest space to have to work with. And the Vine Tooth definitely had some fairly dense, big area denial attacks that would, really suck if they were super powerful here. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the tone of this ending. I think we hit most of the right notes here. I do think that a couple things is I think I would have probably slowed this down quite a bit. I think the lines that come up are appropriate. Like, I love Sam's performance here. I think his delivery um, is spot on. I think any failing for this moment and the tone of this is on my shoulders in terms of I would have loved to have been more delay between when Bram is mourning his mother in that moment, and your commander comes in and just kind of butts in and is like, Bram, I'm sorry. Like, no, no, no. Like, give him a moment. Like, he just lost his mother. And we don't see main characters die like this a whole lot. And so, like, I think the commander is a little bit too like, let's just move on. And I think that this whole expansion has that kind of quality to it, where it's like, let's just go. And I think we just got the pacing wrong on some of this. And I think if I had this to do over, I would have certainly let this moment breathe way more than it did. Uh, but yeah, that's what it is. Um, I also don't know how well I feel about this press F to honor air. Um, yeah, it's not great. I'm not a fan of when games do this, but at the same time, like, I didn't want to force players to kneel if they got close, because what if they didn't care? Like, there are definitely going to be players like an Asura player who's had very little contact with air, maybe, and doesn't necessarily see the sacrifice here. I didn't want to force players into having to kneel. So I do think that having it interact is not a bad thing, but it is. It's one of those weird things. It just feels a little awkward. I wish there was a better way to do this. I couldn't think of one, so I put the press F to honor error. I probably would have. I probably, in hindsight, I've been using hindsight a lot in this recording session. Um, I would have probably done this differently now, where I would have turned this off so that you could only press F once, because it doesn't make sense to have it turn back on again. And that totally would have been doable, and I don't know why I didn't do it. Yeah. All right, so we're at the end of this instance. I added a cinematic here, not again to set up the action, but because I did feel I needed to spend some time here. As I mentioned, I felt like this needed more time to breathe. This is supposed to be a heavy emotional moment. Um, I think it comes close. I don't think it is fully ideally what I wanted it to be. Um, so the cinematic helped because I was able to do kind of a low, slow panning shot that kind of puts you in that moment of, yeah, we're being introspective. We're mourning a loss. We're trying to figure out where we go from here, what's next, and then the instance entry exit pops up. Now, a note about this. This was another thing that I did very deliberately. Um, we cannot follow the death of a major character with a reward splash screen and your loot. Like that's so wrong and off brand and just not in the moment in the spirit of what we're trying to do here. So I ended up doing a split here where I put a step to return to Verdant Brink and meet up with the pact, so that it would force players to exit the instance, um, and have a moment outside of that. That did create a bit of a disconnect in terms of, as you will see, when you exit the instance, you exit it in front of uh, the same area. So you literally traveled in the instance and exited at the spot where you left. But there's the disconnect here is that there was no indication of a temporal shift. And technically, yes, this is I don't know, an hour or several hours or maybe even a day after this last where Air died, because Bram and Air are obviously no longer here. Um, there's now an Itzel scout here. There's a pact member here. So some amount of time has passed that we didn't really see, and it happens off screen, which is fine. It's not egregious. I wish I could have found a better way to communicate that, even if it was like an announcement that just said several hours later. In especially if it was done with the SpongeBob narrative voice of several hours later. But we didn't have that, so there it is. Um, and so you do have to speak to War Master Lisha, who coincidentally is named after my yoga teacher at the time. I do a lot of that. If you notice, many of my characters are named after people that I know. I try to do that as much as I can to honor the people that I care about, and immortalize them in the game somehow. And I was big into yoga while I was developing Heart of Thorns, and my teacher was an amazing uh, and you know um, super friendly person who I just adored as a teacher, because I am not the most flexible person. She was super patient, worked with me on my form and all of that, and so it was just really cool. So I wanted to put her in there, and so then you get the reward splash screen out here, which is, I think, again, feels a lot more appropriate than having a character die and then getting rewarded for it. So, which still is technically what happens, but there's, I think, enough of a disconnect where that disconnect actually works in our favor. I wish we could have shown it a little bit better in terms of showing a change in time. But that's what it is. All right, so that is Prisoners of the Dragon. And yeah, So I think that's gonna be it for today's episode. Hopefully you got something out of this. I'm really enjoying these. I'm in I'm in shape to do much more of these up through Path of Fire, and then I'm really also looking forward to doing some deconstruction on other games. So I'm hoping to maybe accelerate my pace to get through my content in Guild Wars 2 so that I can move on. Or I may just take myself through Heart of Thorns and then take a break and do a little bit of other games and other content that I'd like to take a look at design wise before I hop into Path of Fire. But I'm not sure because I kind of want to put myself through all the Guild Wars 2 content so I can add it to my website. Which, if you haven't noticed, I now have a new website. Uh, if you want to go there, it's www.mindfulgamedesign.com, where I'm going to be sort of having my hub headquarters for any of my content like this. It's where I'm going to put my design portfolio. There are samples of design documents that I've put up there that are sort of give you an insight or a window into how things take shape before we even start implementation. Um, and I've also got my resume, bio, and contact information up there. And I am looking into potentially adding options for mentoring and consultancy and other things, maybe even some of my projects. So I'm going to continue to look into growing this and making this more of a thing than simply me recording some videos on YouTube. Um, so yeah, if you're interested in this, hopefully you'll go check out my website and subscribe, like my videos. That'd be great. And yeah, otherwise I will see you all next time. Thank you.